Daniel sat in the dimly lit office of his family's lawyer, arms crossed, his face set in frustration. The air smelled of old paper and polished wood, the room filled with an eerie silence as he waited for the reading of his late father's will. His father, Richard Sinclair, had lived a modest life, never flaunting wealth, never speaking of hidden fortunes. Daniel had expected little, maybe a small inheritance, a house, or some savings. Instead, when the lawyer handed him a sealed envelope containing his father's final bequest, Daniel's heart sank. Inside was a single sheet of paper listing his inheritance, a collection of paintings, old and amateurish. No stocks, no cash, no property, just dusty paintings that his father had spent years collecting from obscure artists. Daniel clenched his fists. That's it? No money? No house? Just some worthless paintings? He scoffed, shaking his head. This is ridiculous. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. Your father valued those paintings very much, Daniel. He specifically mentioned that they should remain in your care. Daniel let out a dry laugh. He valued them, not me. He had no use for them. In his mind, they were relics of his father's odd obsession with art, paintings that never made sense to him, brushstrokes without meaning. He remembered rolling his eyes as a kid whenever his father brought home another piece, rambling about hidden beauty and forgotten artists. Frustrated and disappointed, Daniel left the office, the envelope crumpled in his hand. The paintings were still in his father's house, the old place he hadn't visited in years. The thought of them gathering dust in the attic made his blood boil. He was a practical man, someone who understood value in dollars, not sentimental nonsense. He needed to get rid of them, sell them, if they were worth anything at all. But little did he know, what he dismissed as worthless would soon change everything. Daniel stood in the musty attic of his late father's house, staring at the stack of paintings propped against the walls. Dust coated the wooden floor, and the stale air carried the faint scent of old varnish. With a frustrated sigh, he grabbed the first painting and held it up to the dim light seeping through the attic window. The canvas was cracked, the colors dull, some abstract mess of brushstrokes. Who would want this? One by one, he dragged them out, stacking them by the door. His plan was simple: get rid of them as fast as possible. He wasn't an art guy, but there had to be someone out there dumb enough to pay for this junk. By the next morning, Daniel had listed them online with generic descriptions. Vintage paintings for sale, signed by unknown artists. Make an offer. He set low prices, expecting at least a few people to show interest. Nothing. Annoyed, he loaded them into his car and drove to a local pawn shop. The owner, a gray-bearded man with thick glasses, examined the paintings for all of 10 seconds before shaking his head. Not much resale value. I can give you $50 for the whole lot. Daniel's jaw tightened. 50? Come on, these are old. Some are signed. You sure they're worthless? The man shrugged. They look like hobby work. People bring in stuff like this all the time, hoping it's valuable. Daniel left, more frustrated than before. He wasn't about to let his father's treasured collection go for $50. Next stop, an art gallery downtown. The curator barely glanced at them before dismissing him with a polite but firm, "These don't fit our clientele." Daniel's patience wore thin. His father had spent years collecting these, yet no one wanted them. Was this his father's idea of a cruel joke? On his way home, stuck in traffic, a thought crossed his mind. Maybe an actual art appraiser could at least tell him what they were. Even if they were worthless, he wanted to hear it from a professional. Pulling over, he did a quick search on his phone. A well-known appraiser worked in town, specializing in old paintings. Maybe this would finally settle the matter. Maybe he could move on. But Daniel had no idea. This next visit would change everything. Daniel pushed open the heavy glass door of Winston & Co. Fine art appraisals, his grip tightening around the stack of paintings in his arms. The office was sleek, walls lined with framed artwork that looked nothing like the ones he carried. A bell chimed, and moments later, an older man in a tailored suit stepped forward. His hair was silver, his expression sharp yet curious. You must be Mr. Sinclair, the man said, extending a hand. I'm Arthur Winston. You mentioned over the phone that you had some paintings for me to look at? Daniel nodded, setting the canvases down with a thud. Yeah, inherited these from my father, trying to figure out if they're worth anything before I toss them. Arthur gave him a knowing look. Many people say that art is often underestimated. He slipped on a pair of white gloves and carefully picked up the first painting. His eyes narrowed as he tilted it under the light. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he turned it over and examined the back. Daniel expected him to dismiss it within seconds, just like the pawn shop owner had. But Arthur didn't. Instead, his posture stiffened, his fingers tracing something on the frame. Where did you say these came from? Arthur asked, his tone suddenly different. My father collected them, Daniel said, now watching the appraiser more closely. No idea where from, probably flea markets or thrift stores. Arthur carefully set the painting aside and picked up another. This time, his reaction was even stronger. His eyebrows lifted, his lips parted slightly. Daniel's pulse quickened. Arthur reached for a magnifying glass and inspected the signature on the lower corner of the painting. The silence in the room grew thick. Then, in a measured voice, he spoke. Mr. Sinclair, I believe your father may have left you something far more valuable than you realize. Daniel's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Arthur exhaled, placing the painting gently on the table. This is the signature of Elias Montclair, a French artist from the early 1900s, known for his unique brushwork. His paintings are rare and extremely valuable. Daniel blinked, barely processing the words. Wait, valuable? Like how much? Arthur leaned back slightly, choosing his words carefully. His last recorded sale at auction? Around $400,000? The air left Daniel's lungs. Arthur wasn't done. He picked up another painting, inspecting the details with intense focus. And this one, if it's authentic, could be worth even more. Daniel felt the room spin. The paintings he had nearly sold for $50, the ones he had called worthless. His father had left him a fortune, and he had almost thrown it all away. Daniel gripped the edge of the appraisal table, his heart pounding like a drum. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as Arthur Winston carefully stacked the paintings back onto the table. $400,000? Daniel echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. Arthur nodded, but his face remained serious. And that's just a rough estimate. If these are genuine Montclairs, and if there are more in the collection, we could be talking about a multi-million-dollar inheritance. Daniel swallowed hard, trying to process what was happening. Just hours ago, he had been desperate to get rid of these paintings, dismissing them as junk. But now, his father had left him a gold mine. But one question gnawed at him. How did my father end up with these? He was never rich. He wasn't some high-end collector. He bought paintings at garage sales, for crying out loud. Arthur studied Daniel for a moment, then removed his glasses. Your father may have known more than you think. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? Arthur leaned forward, tapping his fingers lightly on the table. Elias Montclair was known for painting under different names. His works were often misattributed, and many of his unsigned or forgotten paintings were scattered across Europe and America. If your father had a keen eye, he could have spotted these paintings before the art world realized their true value. Daniel shook his head. That doesn't make sense. My dad wasn't some art expert. Arthur's lips curled into a slight smile. Perhaps he was, in his own way. The thought sent a chill down Daniel's spine. His father had spent years collecting paintings from odd places. Thrift stores, estate sales, flea markets. Daniel had always assumed it was a weird hobby, something his father did for fun. But what if? What if his father had known exactly what he was doing? Daniel ran a hand through his hair. If he knew these were valuable, why didn't he ever sell them? He lived a simple life, never spent much money. Arthur's expression softened. Some collectors don't do it for wealth. Some do it for love. Perhaps your father wasn't chasing money. He was preserving something he believed in. Daniel exhaled, his thoughts racing. If that were true, then his father had spent years sitting on a fortune, never cashing in, never telling anyone. And the more Daniel thought about it, the more it started to make sense. The nights his father would sit in his study, admiring his collection. The way he carefully cleaned each canvas, whispering about lost masterpieces. The way he would shake his head when Daniel teased him about spending money on worthless junk. It wasn't junk. His father had known. A wave of emotions crashed over Daniel. Regret, awe, disbelief. He had mocked his father's passion, rolled his eyes at his collection. And now, standing here, he realized that passion had turned into an unimaginable treasure. Arthur cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Daniel, I'd like to run some official tests to verify authenticity. But if these paintings check out, we'll need to talk about your next steps. Insurance, proper valuation, potential auction houses. Daniel nodded absently, still overwhelmed. He thought about his father's old study, about the paintings he hadn't even bothered to look at. If these were real, then there could be more. And the true scope of his father's secret was yet to be revealed. Daniel barely slept that night. His mind kept replaying Arthur Winston's words, a multi-million-dollar inheritance. If these are genuine Montclairs, his father had left him something beyond imagination, something Daniel had almost thrown away. But if there were more paintings, how much bigger could this be? At sunrise, he drove back to his father's house, his heart racing as he stepped inside. The house was quiet, frozen in time, filled with memories he had long neglected. His father's study was the first place he searched. Daniel switched on the dim yellow light, scanning the small room, the old wooden desk, the dusty bookshelves, the armchair where his father used to sit. And then there was the cabinet. It was an old oak cabinet, its doors slightly worn, the key still in the lock. Daniel hesitated before turning it. The lock clicked. The doors creaked open. His breath caught. Inside, stacked carefully like fragile relics, were dozens more paintings. His hands trembled as he pulled one out. The style, the brushwork, looked familiar. Hadn't Arthur said Montclair used different names? He grabbed another, and another. Some had signatures, some didn't. Then, at the very bottom of the stack, he noticed a small wooden box. He lifted it onto the desk, his fingers fumbling with the latch. It snapped open, revealing a pile of old letters, yellowed with age. The handwriting was his father's. "To my son, Daniel," the first letter began. His heart pounded as he read. "If you're reading this, then you finally took an interest in my paintings. And I hope by now you've realized their worth. Though not just in money, these paintings hold history, secrets, forgotten brilliance. I spent my life rescuing them, and now they are yours to protect." Daniel swallowed hard. "You might be wondering how I found them. It wasn't luck. It was patience, research, a bit of instinct, and a lot of love. I saw what others overlooked, and I hope you'll do the same." Daniel sat down, the letter shaking in his hands. His father had known all along. He had spent years collecting, preserving, believing in something that the world had forgotten. And now Daniel was the keeper of that legacy. Taking a deep breath, he picked up his phone and dialed Arthur Winston. "Arthur, you're going to want to see this." Arthur Winston arrived at Daniel's house within the hour. His usual composed demeanor cracked the moment he stepped into the study and saw the stacks of paintings Daniel had uncovered. "This," Arthur whispered, carefully pulling one canvas into the light. His fingers traced the brushstrokes, his eyes filled with something between awe and disbelief. Daniel swallowed hard. "Are they?" Arthur nodded slowly. "Yes, these are more Montclairs. Some of these could be his lost works, ones that vanished decades ago." He turned to Daniel, his expression deadly serious. "This isn't just an inheritance, Daniel. This is one of the greatest rediscoveries in modern art." Daniel felt his stomach flip. "How much?" Arthur exhaled, glancing around the room before answering. "If these are authenticated, we're talking tens of millions, maybe more." Daniel's legs nearly gave out. Tens of millions. He had spent years chasing financial stability, working long hours, struggling to get ahead. And the entire time, an unimaginable fortune had been collecting dust in his father's house. A fortune his father had spent his life protecting. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, the weight of it all crashing down. I don't even know what to do with all this. Arthur smiled. We'll start with authentication. Then, we'll need to work with museums, auction houses, possibly even the government. There may be historical significance here. Daniel glanced at the small wooden box, still open on the desk, his father's letters stacked inside. His father had left him more than wealth. He had left him a responsibility. For years, Daniel had dismissed him, called him a dreamer. Now he saw the truth. His father wasn't chasing money. He wasn't collecting junk. He was saving history. And now it was Daniel's turn to do the same. As Arthur carefully examined another painting, Daniel picked up one of his father's letters and held it close. Maybe his father had always known this day would come. Maybe that's why he left them to him.